Thank you very much, Beverly, and good morning, everyone. As Beverly said, I am a futurist. It's kind of in that capacity that I'm here, but I'm also in a capacity as a speaker and someone who actually works in meetings and events. So you're going to see these lines cross. Now, a futurist has one job. A futurist tells you what you need to know today so that you are in the best possible position tomorrow. And I actually have a podcast that's dedicated to the future called The Next Billion Seconds, where we take a look at all of the big structural changes, the changes in energy and in transportation, all of these sorts of things. But we're going to focus quite tightly on what's happening to meetings and events. But we're going to start that exploration by actually taking a look at what has just happened to work. Because we have entered a period of incredibly rapid transformation in the way we work. And I just pulled this little article that you see here out of the Fairfax newspapers. It was posted to LinkedIn this morning, where it's really talking about the transition from people traveling for business to people now Zooming, as we're doing now, and how that's going to start to supplant business travel. All of this is playing out against the post-pandemic landscape. But the first place I want to start is actually taking a look at what just happened. What happened over the last year? So the world has been spending for the last decade about $4 trillion a year on IT and IT infrastructure. And for 20 years, economists have been asking why we haven't been seeing a growth in productivity commensurate with that enormous investment. And we finally got the answer in March of last year when the entire world turned on a dime and basically started working from anywhere immediately as soon as the lockdowns began. All of the technology that we'd bought, we thought to make office work better, really wasn't about making office work better, even though it did that. It made work from anywhere possible. If you think about what would have happened if the pandemic had happened in 1990, just 30 years ago, and people had been locked at home for a year in 1990, business would have ground to a halt. There was no way we could have supported the kind of civilization that we have without the enormous technology infrastructure that we have. But now we've learned, and one of the major lessons out of the pandemic is that work is no longer about the office. Yes, the office is a place for certain kinds of work. But now, and for all time after this, work and the office are actually on separate trajectories. So let's take a look at what's actually changed in terms of how we are working. The data is still coming in, but what we think we can see in the data is that the workforce is now sort of divided into three piles. There are people who last year felt was the best year of their lives. These are people who are happiest when they don't have to come into the office at all. That was just a few percent of the workforce prior to the pandemic. It's probably going to be about 25% of the workforce heading into it. So these are the people who are going to be permanently remote workers. Then there are the people who are just needing to get back into the office. These tend to be extroverts. They tend to need other people around to inspire them and to help them work. These are the people who are back in the office almost all the time now because they love it. And then there's an entirely new class of worker that basically didn't exist before the pandemic, what we think of as the hybrid worker, where they're in the office some of the time and then they're out of the office some of the time. The pandemic showed them a new way to be able to work, which allowed them to be as productive, but gave them a lot more flexibility than they had experienced before that. And these structural changes in the workforce will be reflected in the structural changes of meetings and events going forward. But we really need to take a look at how the workforce, because this is going to be as true for meetings and events firms as it is for any other firm in the world, how we need to change our management practices to deal with these new classes of workers. One of the things that we found out right away was not only did the remote workforce immediately double in size and expected to double in size again by 2025, so it will be 25 to 30% of the workforce by 2025. But because of the studies that were done during the pandemic, it was very quickly learned that the more remote a worker is, the greater their need for face-to-face with their management. This is the paradox of remote working, because a remote worker, though they may be self-directed, actually needs that constant check-in with the manager to keep them on task and on course and doing the right things at the right time. So the paradox here is that a remote worker is not less of a management responsibility. A remote worker is actually an increased management responsibility because of that increased need to connect. And then we have this enormous class of hybrid workers. And the one thing that we can absolutely say about the hybrid workers is that not only are they coming out of nowhere, every single one of them is different. Every single one of them has a unique set of needs for what they need day to day, week to week, year to year. And they're confronting management and organizations that haven't actually given a lot of thought about how they can handle a continuous negotiation with a workforce that is constantly exploring all of the ways that it wants to flexibly deliver work, but also flexibly work. And a lot of this is because prior to the pandemic, most organizations didn't really have really detailed work from anywhere policies. And this is the next place we need to go, because as people come back into the office now, whether it's 1 day a week, 3 days a week, 1 day a month, all sorts of policies are going to need to be in place, but not just policies, negotiation strategies. And this is now the next place that management is going to have to go, because every hybrid worker will present a continuous negotiation task with management. And that's going to be something that's going to be a process that managers will need to budget their time and attention to. And then, of course, there's the workers who are always in the office, who thrived on having other workers in the office with them. They will need extra management attention, because they're going to need to find out how to paper over the gaps when the people they're working with in a team are either remote or they're hybrid. So all of a sudden, what we've done is we've changed the structure of the office. We now need to change our management practices in line with that. One of the things that we now know is that, in fact, because people work from anywhere, and they're certainly working from home a lot, the office is no longer the locus of work. It's no longer the place where you check in, you sit down at your desk, you work for 8 hours, you get up and you leave. In fact, coming into the office constitutes something like a special occasion. The office is the place where you connect. It's funny, Beverly was just talking before we went live on this call about how she feels like she's being less productive when she's in the office a few days a week now. It's like, no, you're connecting with your team, you're building relationships with the team. You're having those moments of serendipity and connection. There's a really famous story when Steve Jobs built the Pixar facility, which is in Richmond, California, when they were making the early Pixar films. Huge building, lots of people working in it. He put a mailroom down on the bottom floor in a great big atrium area. So you'd never get mail delivered to your desk at Pixar. You had to go to the mailroom to get your mail. And everyone who worked at Pixar always said that that trip to the mailroom every day was the most productive part of the day, because they never knew who they'd run into and the conversations that they would have and the ideas that would get sparked. That's the serendipity that makes creative office work important, and that's what the office is going forward. And it seems to me, although we haven't quite fleshed that out yet, there's enormous scope for the meetings and events industry to create the kinds of serendipity in office time that we're going to need in offices in order to keep the team coherent in a workforce that is now much more scattered. All right, so that's the general shape of the workforce over the next 15 or 20 years. Let's narrow this down to what's been happening to events. So pretty much the first big thing that happened as the pandemic caused a global lockdown was a series of large physical public events moved online. The first one to move online was Microsoft's Build Conference, which happens in Seattle every year, gets around 6,000 people. And they said, okay, well, we can't do this. We can't bring you here. We'll all infect one another. We'll have it online this year. And something completely unexpected happened. The number of people who attended Build went from 6,000 to 230,000. So because they made it possible for everyone to attend the event, everyone did attend the event. And now it looks like Microsoft is just not going back to having physical events again, because this event was, from their point of view, in terms of meeting their needs with their audience, so much more successful. And we saw exactly the same thing happen with Google I/O, which is a similar form event, and Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference. And as we're heading into conference season this year, these conferences are continuing to stay online, because as virtual events, they were able to achieve a scale and a reach that made them much better for those companies as events than physical events. So we saw that just by being forced online, people actually discovered an entirely new way to be able to deliver an event. Now, for my own part, I was looking at, and Zoe can attest to this, my schedule emptied out. As soon as the pandemic began, all that came in was cancellations. All of you would be familiar with this. I had a good friend who came to me and dropped me an email and said, Mark, I run an organization called YPO, Young Presidents Organization. We're looking for someone to give a talk about the future after the pandemic. Would you do that? And this was in May. And I was like, yeah, actually, I'd be happy to do that. And I'd be happy to do it over Zoom. And then I gave a lot of thought to actually what it would mean to be giving an effective talk over Zoom. And that was when I built out the infrastructure that you see me using in the background here, where I'm green screened against my slides and all of this. And there's microphones and there's studio lighting in here. This is my home office. My home office over the course of a month basically became something like a live streaming studio. And this is an early shot. This is a shot, in fact, right before I did that talk for YPO in June of last year. There's a bit more kit in here now. But what I wanted to do is to show both myself and the audience was there is a way to be able to deliver depth involvement over a medium that people were using so much that they were actually groaning at, oh my God, not another Zoom, not another Zoom, not another. But actually show that it could be a performance medium. That in fact, if we stepped up, and that was a big call to arms for me to be able to step up with my own skills because I had taught at 2 cinema schools. I had some cinema skills to start to integrate those into my practice to be able to bring some of the best qualities of live events into a virtual format. All right. Let's talk about what the landscape looks like now and going forward over the next 10 years. Over here you see real-world events. Over on the far side you see virtual events. We are all familiar with what real events are like. At the small scale, it's a meeting in the office, 10 or 15 people getting together for a meeting. Medium scale, there's the Material Sciences Conference that was in Melbourne in 2019, under 1,000 people. Large scale, what did you have? You had the Intensive and Critical Care Conference. That was 3,000 people again here in Melbourne. Physical events in Australia top out. I mean, there are large sporting events and things like that, but the kinds of meeting events that we think about, they top out somewhere between sort of 3,000 and 5,000. And a lot of that's because at a certain point, physical events stop scaling. The biggest physical event that I go to regularly is the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, which is 300,000 people. And the joke about CES is that it is so big that you can never really plan on meeting everyone. Even though you will probably run into almost everyone you know, you can't plan on it because there's really no way for you to find one another in such a big event. You have to rely entirely on serendipity. And so what we see is that with real-world events, they're amazing. They have a lot of serendipity, but they don't scale in the same way that virtual events. On the other hand, if you want to have an accidental meeting and make an accidental connection or a friendship, real-world events are always going to be better than virtual events for that. All right. Then you get to the really big virtual events. And we already talked about these, things like Microsoft Build, Google I/O, and Apple's WWDC. These events will persist in their virtual form because they are serving a huge global audience. And that is serving both the customers and the companies that are sponsoring these events. Those events have gone virtual, and it is unlikely that they will ever really come back in the same way again in the physical world. Now, at the same time, last year, right after I did my YPO event, I got a contact from a group that I work with called the CFO Series. The CFO Series does physical events all around the country where they bring CFOs together for a breakfast or a lunch, and there are speakers who will talk about the current topics. And I get invited in to talk about future trends in finance. And they went online because they had to. But they found this very curious thing. So often they would do one event a year in New Zealand, and they would go to Auckland because that's the big city, and they'd get about 100 people. Well, in July, we had an event in New Zealand that was virtual, and they got 350 people because they got people from all over New Zealand coming into the virtual event. So they had by far the best attendance that they ever had, and the organizers were repeatedly thanked by New Zealanders who had never been able to make it to an event in Auckland. They saw the same thing when they did the events online in Queensland and in WA and in Melbourne and Sydney, that people who couldn't take the time or lived too far out of the CBD to be able to come in comfortably were actually really satisfied by the virtual event. So that's a mid-size event. That's a few hundred people. That's clearly creating a new class of event that can be held in that space. And then there's the smaller events like YPO and even this event where you're talking about sort of low tens of people, 20, 30, 40 people. There's still a really strong need to have clear production values and leadership because otherwise it's just another boring Zoom call. And by the way, at the bottom of this list, there are now countless numbers of Zoom calls that people are subjected to, that we basically do without thinking through how we can make this wonderful and engaging for everyone who has to endure them. All right, so those are the real and the virtual events. Then what we see is this new emerging hybrid class of events. So these are events that are taking place both in the real and in the virtual. These are events where people are really trying to have it both ways. And they're trying to have it both ways because we're seeing that you can get both greater engagement in those situations, but also because they can serve a larger audience in those occasions. And I can tell from my own practice, some of this is because we're still kind of in the pandemic, but some of this is because what my clients are asking for, that the last couple of high-level board briefing, executive leadership, workshops, that sort of thing that I've been doing, they have been hybrid events. So I've just finished a series of events for Essential Energy, and I did another set of events for Commonwealth Bank, and some of the people were in the room, some of the people were Zooming in. So we see that the hybrid form, it's something that is probably going to persist, but we're not good at it right now. Everything about it is that the people who are remote are getting a much lower quality of experience than the people who are in the real. Unless you have a fully virtual event, we've basically decided that it's in the too hard basket to make something that works just as well for people who are virtual as people who are real. We are going to need to work hard to solve that, because if the future of events looks like the future for the office, then about 35% of our events will be fully real, about 25% of our events will be fully virtual, and about 40% of our events will be hybrid. That will become the largest category of events. All right, let's talk about what we need in terms of skills to be able to meet that need for hybrid events. Because right now, again, we don't really have a super good set of skills around this. So let's start to outline what some of those skills are. There are a whole set of hard skills. Now, I was lucky because I have taught at film school, because I've learned from cinematographers and people who do production and sound design. I had a lot of these media production skills to begin with. There aren't necessarily people inside meeting and events organizations who are equipped to be able to think in those hard skills. And we need to start to think about what that means. So it's media production, so that you're working both in the real and in the virtual for that hybrid sweet spot. What does the camera needs? What do the lighting needs? Sound needs? Makeup, green screening, live streaming, all of these are sort of new technologies. Yes, we've had events where there would be a camera focused on a podium, live streaming it out to an audience. That is not a hybrid event. That is a real event that you're allowing people peeking into. That is not a hybrid event. A hybrid event is where the participation between the real and the virtual participants is basically equivalent. Yeah, they're not having exactly the same experience, but they're both having an equivalent class of experience. And I need to say, again, in 2021, we barely know how to do this. That's not a bad thing. It just indicates what we need to learn, because I think that the organizations that get this right will end up owning that middle 40%. All right, so those are the hard skills. Let's talk about some of the soft skills. For people who are actually providing the talent in these events, one of the things that I need to stress is performing to camera. It's not just talking down the lens of the camera. It's actually being able to do all of the associated production around that, so that when you're delivering an event, whether it's both in real and in virtual, it is presenting something that is compelling to both audiences simultaneously. And again, we're just at the beginning of this. So we really need to start to think about this, but we also need to start to ask all professional speakers to be able to step up. A professional speaker should not simply be sitting at a desk in front of a webcam when they're giving a talk at a conference. That is simply not good enough. It's a disservice to the audience, it's a disservice to the event. We have to be asking more from them, but that means we're going to have to be offering them the supports there. Now, the other thing, because I do both event speaking and event moderation, is moderating an event that is both real and virtual is a balancing act. I did a virtual event somewhere during the pandemic when I was trying to moderate 4 panelists that I was simultaneously interviewing, plus getting questions thrown to me in the chat box, plus getting questions thrown to me via text message on my smartphone. And you don't actually have enough brain bandwidth to be able to do all of that. So we need to think about how we can build moderation support systems for people who are actually in that performance zone so that they can fully integrate the connection to the real audience, which is very important, but also, very importantly, the connection to the virtual audience, so they can create that hybrid connection, which makes everyone feel like they're being listened to. All right. Event producers themselves have a couple of new tasks. One of them is audience management. And again, it's this idea that you're managing both an audience in the real and an audience that's virtual. And that those aren't 2 separate tasks. They're 2 sides of the same coin. So how do we do that? How do we make those audiences feel like they're not 2 separate cohorts, but that they're a single audience? We don't have great tools for any of this yet because all of the tools we built are either for real audiences or for virtual audiences, but we need to start thinking and we need to start asking the questions about those kinds of tools, because if we ask questions about the kinds of tools we need, people will start to build those tools for us. All right. Expectation management. And again, this is from the client, because all of the clients will start to go, okay, I actually want a hybrid event. And you're going to have to go, all right, here are the trade-offs. Here are the wins. Here are the decisions you will need to make now. Here's the way you're going to have to hold that event to make it happen. So a lot of that is getting so familiar with what's possible with hybrid events that you can make it very clear to the client what they can expect from that event. And as soon as there are a few good, high-quality hybrid events on offer, everyone will be looking to those sorts of events as prototypes. And so an event manager is going to have to be able to say, yes, we can do this. No, we can't do this. Here's why. And finally, the thing that the event manager is now going to have to really worry about is fostering serendipity. When people aren't all in the same physical space together, serendipity becomes much more rare. A virtual event, yeah, you might find serendipity in a chat box. It's possible, or you might just find 2 people arguing in a chat box. I was moderating an event in November where one of the people in the audience of several hundred just decided that they were going to go on a rant, and the conference organizers in the background actually had to throw that person out of the conference because they were polluting the chat stream for everyone else. But at the same time, while that behavior can't be permitted, everything has to be done to be able to connect people who are physically present and people who are virtually present in meaningful ways that can encourage that kind of accidental learning together, that accident that is serendipity. All right, so let's now talk about what the hybrid skills are. The hybrid skills are both ends. Yes, it is having a lot of strong technology background because all of the virtual production is technology based, but it's also having strong touch skills. So understanding how to reach people, not just virtually, but in the real world. And we have to find the balance there because it is tech and touch. Then there's this new balance between performing and listening, because a big part of fostering serendipity is presenting the quiet spaces where the audience can find one another to connect, but at the same time, presenting the kind of story and narrative and presentation style that allows them to come together. So it's allowing them to come together, but also allowing them to breathe together. And then there's negotiations and guidelines around what's going to be possible in this event, what will be asked of the performers in that event, what will be asked of the audience in that event. How do you make that palatable? How do you make it not onerous? What kinds of guidelines can you give a company that's approaching you for an event about how they need to think, how they need to continuously negotiate with their audience? And then, and this is something that happened quite accidentally, I realized that once I'd got these skills and I was able to, say, moderate an event in Paris or moderate an event in Melbourne from my office in Sydney, I realized that now all event companies and all event performers have global reach now. But we haven't actually built any meetings and events organizations that really do global scale events because it wasn't on the list of possibilities before the pandemic. This is one of the great gifts of the pandemic. And the pandemic has been absolutely horrible for so many people in so many ways. But it's also given us a few wins. And one of the things that it's given us as a win is this capability to be able to bring global talent into a local event and bring local talent out to a global audience. We have a capacity to build meetings and events organizations that can satisfy that and also create amazing hybrid events that are both local and global. So to just close here for a second, I have been for 12 years going to a lovely little meditation group that meets Monday nights in Sydney. And in March last year, it all went online. And for the last year on Monday nights, I have been sitting with my iPad open, meditating via Zoom, which works remarkably well. We were all surprised about how well it worked. And a lot of folks were really happy with it. A lot of folks weren't happy with it. They sort of drifted away. One of the things that did happen was that we started getting meditation teachers, not just from the Sydney area, but from around the world. So we had meditation teachers coming to us from Britain. We had meditation teachers coming to us from America. We had meditation teachers coming to us from Brazil and from all around Australia. Not only that, we had folks coming into the meditation sessions who were from all around the world. So our pokey little meditation group became a global meditation group. I mean, it didn't grow enormously. It wasn't like we had thousands of people, but it became something that was still lovely, but different because it was virtual. Well, 2 weeks ago, we went back to having real world events because we could, because the world is now safe for that sort of thing. But immediately, the audience of folks who had been attending virtually asked us if we could continue broadcasting those meetings on Zoom. And when the call went out for volunteers, I raised my hand because I have the skills to be able to do it. So right now we're sort of trying to figure out what does it mean to be in the room with someone who's teaching you how to meditate and at the same time sharing that with Zoom. This is a question we wouldn't have thought we were going to ask, but because we had that virtual experience, now the people who came in as a result of that virtual experience are asking us in our little meditation group to deliver a hybrid experience. So the last thing I want to leave you with, I think, is something that needs to be our guiding principle over the next years, which is that the future favors the flexible. It's not just about being real or virtual. It's about finding the sweet spots in there and making the most of them.